Today we're going to talk about how to write a short story from start to finish. So a short story is, the usual length for that is between 1500 words and 7500 words. If it's under 1500 words, it is generally called flash fiction. And if it's over 7500 words, then we're in novelette territory. So how do you begin to actually write a story of that length? There's no sort of right way to write a story, and there's several methods of writing, but I'll look a bit at the process and at the things you can do, and particularly I'll look at this book, which is basically on novels. It's called Outlining Your Novel, but it has useful things about outlining stories that are shorter as well. Basically, writers, either they do a process that is called pantsing or a process called outlining. Pantsing is what the majority of writers do, particularly amateur writers who just start out. So what happens is you have the vaguest of ideas about what you want to write about, and then you just start and you just write. And then it just goes on. It's a very organic process. You can let the characters surprise you, which is a good thing. You can have unexpected plot twists. You can have characters sort of leading their own life to an important extent. And that is a process that works perfectly well for some people, and there's also high-profile authors who work like that. The big downside is that you really have to carefully revise, even more carefully than if you outline. Sometimes the logic of the story just doesn't work, so then you have to be prepared to basically cut large parts of your first draft or rework parts of your first draft. So you have to allow yourself plenty of drafts when you pants. You also have to be prepared to rewrite. You have to be particularly cognizant of the pacing of the story, which could be uneven if you just write organically. Then the other way of doing it is this outlining process. So what is outlining? Outlining is basically that you put down some ideas about what the plot will be about, what the characters will be about, what the setting will be about. So you have worked out the main thing that's going to happen in a short story. Usually there's one sort of main event. You have the characters, how the conflict is resolved, and the outline gives you a roadmap. It gives you an idea about where you're going through. And that's very useful also for writer's block. Like writer's block usually would be if you just don't know how the story continues, but if you have your outline, you can always go back to the outline. Now you have an idea about how you could use outlines, and I'll go on a little bit more about them in a moment. But the question is, what are you going to write about? What is your story going to be about? Many short stories, many novels, etc. start with the idea of what if. For example, what if an orphan was given a great fortune unexpectedly? And then you have basically the plot of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. And you can use these to stir your imagination, these what if questions, because particularly as Weiland argues in this book, you don't have to look for obvious answers. You have to look just a little bit further. What if this happened? This could happen, which is like the thing you would expect to happen, but this could happen, which is a less expected thing to happen. Such and such could happen. Something could be there to obstruct the protagonist's goals and so on. So you have to try to think a little bit deeper and of some unexpected answers to sort of get your what if question framed. Using the what if question as a premise, you can then identify the ingredients that constitute the viable plot. So what are those ingredients? You have to think of a protagonist. Who is she? What does she do? Where? And you place that person in a difficult situation, which I'll say something about a little bit more. You might wonder, so one of the things that really help is to think about your characters having certain goals and aspirations. You could, for instance, do the exercise that some writers do of interrogating your character. So you talk to her and you say, so what's up? What do you want? Like, why aren't you getting what you want? Stuff like that. Now, outliners will tell you that even if you never describe the character, even if you don't see any physical description at all, although a bit of physical description, as we've seen in earlier videos, is really handy to sort of separate out different characters and to sort of give labels for the reader, devices for them to remember who's who. But even if you never describe the character, it's still handy to have a sense of who they are. So you could, in your outline, put things such as age, height, ethnicity, gender. Think about the goals and desires. So one easy way to build a character is to think about, say, a constellation of different virtues. So, for example, a character can be courageous and spontaneous. And then, because you don't want to create saints, you want to have believable people, you also think about a few vices that you can throw in, such as maybe she's impatient. So she's courageous, spontaneous, impatient. Similarly, you can have bad characters that are mostly vices, but you can just throw in one or two good features of them to make them at least believable and to create something of a tension when you have those characters interrelate. Another central element next to character is the central conflict. In a story, there's usually going to be just one central conflict, which is essential to plot. If you don't have conflict, then your characters just amble about on the page aimlessly. And many beginning writers feel a bit squeamish to put their protagonist into difficulty, but you shouldn't feel bad about that. You should just put them in difficulty. Don't make it a downer, though. If your protagonist just suffers from the beginning to end, then people only have so much empathy, and the empathy starts to drain away. So here I'm going to just read a little quote from Weiland from the Outlining Your Novel book. So, this is about conflict. Who says conflict is a bad thing? Who says world peace is the most important goal of humanity? Who says arguing with your little brother when you're a kid means you'll grow up to be an ill-mannered ruffian? Not a writer. You can break every rule and still have a whopper of a story, so long as you remember to throw in a dash of conflict. Or actually, a heaping tablespoon or two would be preferable. And yet many inexperienced authors forget all about conflict when planning their stories. One of the most common problems I encounter in editing unpublished author manuscripts is a complete lack of conflict. Authors allow their characters to wander aimlessly about their pages, hardly speaking to the other characters, hardly encountering any obstacle except usually a dreary worldview. No matter how marvelous your character, your plot, or your writing, no reader is going to be able to resist yawning in boredom over the lack of conflict. So conflict is important to keep the reader engaged, and it's also a very interesting and easy way to make your story go forward. So recall how I mentioned earlier that if you have a story, and that a story basically consists of, the story itself, the telling itself, then the plot, which is sort of like the IMDb short summary. But then you also have the big idea, like this story is really about alienation, or this story is really about consumerism, or this story is really about how people who are in love can't communicate. And very often, it's only after a while, when you write the story, even when you outline it well in advance, that the governing idea becomes clear. So very often you don't have to have the governing idea at the outset. It sort of becomes obvious as the story progresses. So once you have an outline, a reasonable idea of where you want to go, then you can just write. And basically, this is good advice also for article writing. You shouldn't edit while you write. So especially not the very first draft. You just write, and you just don't care about things like word count or other things, or too much detail or pacing. You don't care about all that. You just write, keeping in mind the outline. And then suppose you have some good ideas, but they don't really fit, then you can just have like a separate document, or you can use software like Scrivener to put those ideas separately that maybe can still come in. Put them in bullet points, separate notes. And then you have your first draft. And then later in the next installment, we will talk about the editing process.